April 18th, 1943, Chesapeake Bay, Maryland. The wind was brutal that morning, sharp enough to bite through the thick canvas of naval jackets. The gray waves of the bay slapped against the steel hull of a small, boxy prototype craft that looked more like an unfinished barn than a vessel of war. A group of naval officers stood watching from the dock, their breath steaming in the cold air, eyes fixed on a single man kneeling beside a mounted rudder system. Lieutenant Commander Andrew Higgins, an engineer from New Orleans with a temper as fiery as his ambition, was muttering to himself as he tightened a bolt with bare, reddened hands. Beside him stood Captain Elmer Glenn, clipboard in hand, skeptical as ever. "You're telling me this thing can turn 90 degrees in open water?" Glenn barked, raising an eyebrow. Higgins didn't look up. "Not telling you, Captain. I'm showing you." He slapped the side of the craft, a strange hybrid of flat-bottomed hull and raised bow door. Painted crudely in white letters across its flank were the words LCVP, Landing Craft, Vehicle, Personnel, though Higgins liked to call it something else, the Hedgehog. The name came not from its look but its attitude, compact, stubborn, bristling with hidden strength. The Navy had laughed at his proposal months earlier. A landing craft that could pivot sharply at sea, turn on command to adjust to waves or obstacles was considered absurd. "Ships don't dance," one admiral had said. But Higgins, a man who once built swamp boats to outmaneuver smugglers and bayou tides, refused to accept that. He knew that in the chaos of amphibious war, maneuverability was survival. As the test began, Higgins climbed aboard with two young engineers, Tom Kellis and Mark Darden. They fired up the diesel engine, the vibration rumbling through the deck. From the dock, Glenn gave a half-wave to the radio operator. "Proceed with Test Run 1, came the crackling voice over the loudspeaker. The Hedgehog lurched forward, slicing through the water at 20 knots. Spray lashed across Higgins' goggles as he grinned against the wind. "Brace for turn," he shouted. Kellis grabbed the railing. Darden adjusted the new twin rudder control. Then it happened. At Higgins' signal, the rudders rotated in opposite directions, one pushing, one pulling. The Hedgehog swung to starboard fast, too fast. The whole craft heeled violently, throwing spray high into the air. On shore, officers staggered back as the craft executed a perfect 90-degree turn, then leveled itself with shocking precision. It skimmed across the bay in a new direction, as agile as a speedboat. "Son of a..." Glenn's clipboard hit the ground. The impossible had worked. Higgins cut the engine and stood tall, drenched but smiling. "Gentlemen," he called across the water, "that's how we'll land in Europe." The men on the dock were silent. For the first time, the thought of invading Hitler's fortress didn't feel like suicide. It felt like strategy. But Higgins knew better than anyone that engineering alone wouldn't win a war. The Hedgehog would have to prove itself not in calm bay waters, but under machine gun fire, on a coast bristling with steel and death. And in less than a year, that test would come on the blood-soaked sands of Normandy. January 1944, New Orleans, Louisiana. The scent of oil and molten steel filled the massive Higgins Industries shipyard. Sparks flew like fireworks from welders' torches as hundreds of men worked in furious rhythm, hammering rivets and tightening bolts under the deafening hum of machines. The war had turned this city of jazz and riverboats into a symphony of industry. Every clang, every spark, every bead of sweat built toward one goal: D-Day. At the center of the chaos strode Andrew Higgins, his white shirt smeared with soot, his eyes sharp behind smoke-tinted goggles. He barked instructions as he weaved through the rows of skeletal hulls lined up for completion. "Reinforce that bow ramp," he shouted to a foreman. "If it jams in the surf, those boys are dead before they even step off." He wasn't exaggerating. The Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France depended on landing craft that could deliver men and vehicles right onto the beach, fast enough to overwhelm the German defenses. The Hedgehog's design, later refined into the now iconic LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, had proven capable of sharp maneuvers and quick disembarkation. It could pivot, realign, and unload soldiers directly onto sand or shingle. but it had to be perfect. By night, Higgins pored over test reports under a single flickering bulb in his office. Sheets of schematics lay scattered around him. Rudder stress tests, hull flex data, ramp reliability scores, all marked in red ink. His engineers warned him they were behind schedule. His Navy contacts warned him they were running out of patience. Higgins didn't care. He was chasing something bigger than approval. He was chasing certainty that when those young men hit the beach, his craft would not fail them. "Andy," said Captain Glenn, stepping into the office one evening holding a telegram, "the Brits are asking for 600 more. They're calling it Operation Overlord." He paused. "They want to land on 5 beaches. Normandy. It's going to be hell." Higgins leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "Then let's build them faster than hell itself." Production exploded overnight. Higgins Industries operated 24 hours a day. Housewives welded, high schoolers riveted, and veterans supervised construction. Within months, more than 20,000 landing craft, many modeled after Higgins' Hedgehog, rolled off the assembly line. So indispensable were they that General Eisenhower later declared, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." But in early 1944, victory was far from certain. Higgins stood at the edge of a completed LCVP, running his hand over the cold steel bow. He thought of the men who would storm the beaches, boys from Iowa, New York, Texas, none of whom knew his name. And that was fine with him. He whispered, "Just bring them home." The first Hedgehogs were loaded onto transport ships bound for the British coast. In a matter of months, these strange, boxy crafts would face their baptism by fire. June 6th, 1944, 5:30 hours, English Channel. Thousands of vessels stretched across the gray horizon. Engines growled beneath rolling fog. The sea was restless whitecaps snapping under the weight of history. Aboard one of the lead transports, rows of LCVPs bobbed in the waves, their ramps locked tight, their motors idling like beasts waiting to be unleashed. On the deck stood Lieutenant John Steele, clutching his helmet as he peered over the railing. "They say the Krauts have machine guns on every cliff," he murmured to the sergeant beside him. The sergeant smirked. "Then let's see if Higgins built us a miracle." At 6:29, the order came. "Lower away the Hedgehogs!" The cables screeched as the landing craft splashed into the channel. Higgins' invention, once laughed at in design halls, was now carrying the fate of the free world. June 6th, 1944, 6:37 hours, Omaha Beach, Normandy. The sea was chaos incarnate. Gray waves churned with diesel smoke and drifting bodies. Machine gun fire rattled across the water like steel hail, cutting through spray and screams alike. The first line of Higgins' Hedgehogs, the LCVPs, charged toward the shore in tight formation, their flat hulls slamming against the surf with every rise and fall of the tide. Inside, one of them crouched Lieutenant John Steele, his knuckles white around his rifle. Water sloshed around his boots. He could smell oil, gunpowder, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Around him, men of the 116th Infantry clung to the benches, helmets low, rifles ready. The coxswain, Ensign Richard Red Moreau, shouted over the roar of the engine. 30 seconds, he called out. A shell exploded close by, sending a geyser of seawater over the bow. The Hedgehog lurched but held steady. Steele looked at the ramp ahead, now splattered with salt and mud. The men were terrified, but the boat held its course, pivoting sharply to avoid debris and wreckage, executing the kind of tight maneuver only Higgins' design could make. 10 seconds! The shoreline was clearer now, too clear. Through the smoke, they could see the jagged outlines of the German defenses. Concrete bunkers, steel hedgehogs, and barbed wire glinting in the morning light. The air smelled of cordite and death. "Drop the ramp!" Moreau slammed the lever. The front ramp crashed into the surf with a deafening clang. "Go, go, go!" The soldiers surged forward, wading through waist-deep water as bullets tore into the waves around them. Steele stumbled, the cold cutting through him like knives. Behind him, the Hedgehog shuddered as shrapnel peppered its hull, but it didn't sink. Its shallow draft and reinforced panels absorbed the punishment, keeping the next wave of troops safe as they leapt off into the fray. All across the beach, Hundreds of similar craft landed almost simultaneously. The Germans had expected chaos, bottlenecks, failed landings. Instead, Higgins's design allowed the Allies to maintain a relentless rhythm, craft after craft, unloading men and vehicles, pivoting, retreating, and returning for more. The LCVPs could back out of the surf, turn in a narrow channel, and head back to the transports in minutes. To the German defenders, it was surreal. From the bluffs above, Oberst Hans Kranefeld watched through his binoculars, stunned. "Sie kommen, sie drehen in der See," he muttered. "They come, and they turn in the sea." He had never seen landing boats move like that. Their precision defied the churning waters and the artillery raining down around them. His officers had been briefed that the Allies would choke in the surf. They were wrong. By 7:45, the first armored vehicles began to roll ashore. Tanks, jeeps, and artillery pieces delivered by the same impossible craft the U.S. Navy once mocked. Smoke billowed from the cliffs as Allied bombers roared overhead. The tide turned red, but the line held and advanced. In the chaos of battle, Higgins' creation became more than a machine. It became a lifeline. Wounded soldiers were dragged back into its hold for evacuation. Commanders used it as makeshift cover during retreats. Its flat-bottomed hull and quick-turn rudders made it the unsung hero of every inch gained on that hellish beach. By midday, Omaha was secured barely. Of the first wave, thousands lay dead or wounded, but tens of thousands more had made it ashore. And without the Hedgehogs, many of them would have drowned before even setting foot on French soil. As the smoke cleared, Lieutenant Steele sat slumped beside the wreck of his craft, its hull pockmarked with bullet holes. He ran a hand along the steel, whispering, "She got us here." And somewhere across the channel, in a quiet New Orleans office far from the sound of gunfire, Andrew Higgins received the first telegram confirming the landings. He read the single line aloud. "The craft performed beautifully. The beaches are ours." He exhaled, sinking into his chair. Outside, the Mississippi rolled on, indifferent and eternal. Higgins smiled faintly. "You did it, girl," he murmured, thinking of his steel Hedgehog. "You got them home." But even as the war machine rolled inland, another truth was dawning. The Germans, now reeling from the shock of D-Day, had realized too late that one American's impossible dream had rewritten the rules of invasion forever. August 1944. Normandy, France. The beaches were quiet now. The thunder of artillery had faded to the low hum of engines and the distant cries of gulls circling above the wreckage. Along the coast, rows of twisted metal, shattered helmets, and burned-out vehicles bore silent testimony to the price of liberation. But scattered among the debris were the remnants of something else, the landing craft that made it all possible. Their steel hulls lay half buried in the sand, scarred by shrapnel, bullet-ridden, but unmistakable in shape. The flat-bottomed boats with their yawning ramps had carried the first wave of men into history. Locals scavenged the remains for metal and fuel, never realizing that these ugly, utilitarian boxes were the machines that had saved Europe. Thousands of miles away, in Washington, D.C., Andrew Higgins stood before a committee of senior officers. The war was turning decisively in the Allies' favor. France was being liberated. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had crumbled, yet Higgins looked restless, almost defiant, as if victory was a burden rather than a prize. "Mr. Higgins," said Admiral Ernest King, folding his hands on the table, "your craft exceeded every expectation. The Army and Navy are both recommending full commendation." Higgins nodded but didn't smile. "Admiral, I don't need medals. I need men to come home." King studied him, then leaned back. "They did, Andrew. Because of you." It was true. By war's end, more than 20,000 LCVPs, Higgins' perfected Hedgehogs, had carried soldiers across every major amphibious landing of the war: Sicily, Salerno, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and, of course, Normandy. They had delivered troops, tanks, supplies, and hope. Their 90-degree rudder design, simple and ingenious, gave commanders maneuverability in waters once thought impossible to navigate. They turned the tide literally of modern warfare. Back in New Orleans, Higgins returned to his shipyards, where the welders had gone home and the machines were silent. He walked through the vast hangars, now dim and dusty, and ran his hand over one of the last finished hulls. Its surface was cold, but alive with memory. Tom Kellis, his young engineer from the test days, approached quietly. "You know, Andy," he said, "they're calling these boats Higgins' Miracle. Even Eisenhower said you won the war for us." Higgins gave a dry laugh. "I didn't win it. The boys who stepped off that ramp did." He paused, staring out at the river beyond the dock. "I just built them a door. They had the courage to walk through it." For the men who fought, that door became a symbol. They remembered the sudden drop of the ramp, the burst of light and sound, the smell of salt and cordite, the first step onto enemy soil. They remembered that no matter how bad the seas or the shells, the Hedgehog got them there. In a war defined by innovation, the atomic bomb, radar, the jet engine, it was a humble steel boat designed by a stubborn American engineer that changed everything. Years later, historians would write that D-Day's success was the product of strategy, courage, and overwhelming force. But in the testimonies of the men who were there, a different truth emerged. They spoke of the roar of engines, the sudden turn in the surf, the moment the ramp fell, and the sense that, somehow, the craft itself was alive, fighting with them. In museums across the world today, a few of those boats still exist, rusted, preserved, revered. If you stand close, you can still see the weld lines, still trace the signature of Higgins' hand in every curve. They are not sleek, not beautiful, not elegant, but they are immortal. Because in June 1944, when the fate of the free world hinged on a strip of sand, one impossible design made the difference. Andrew Higgins died in 1952 at age 65. When asked once what drove him through years of rejection and doubt, he said simply, "I didn't build boats, I built chances." And on that gray morning in Normandy, as thousands of young men stormed the beaches, those chances became destiny.